From sunrise hikes to afternoon foraging sessions, the unsolved cases included in this episode feature stories of victims who ventured into nature and never made it home. Each of these little-known cases is in critical need of tips from the public, so join us as we recount the final hikes of 5 separate victims in this special multi-case episode of Last Seen Alive. Stories in this episode include the 1986 murder of Jane Pritchard, a botany student who was killed with a shotgun blast while studying botanical specimens in Delaware's Blackbird State Forest. The 2006 double-homicide of Mary and Susanna Stodden, a mother-daughter pair who were fatally shot while hiking together on Washington's rugged Pinnacle Lake Trail. The 2022 disappearance of Niqi Cavanaugh-De Calderon, a professional ballerina and avid forager who vanished during a walk in woods near Oregon's Mount Hood. And the 2023 murder of Dr. Honoree Fleming, an accomplished academic who was fatally shot while hiking her favorite trail in Vermont's picturesque lake region. Thanks for listening to Last Seen Alive. I'm your host, Leah, crime analyst by day and true crime storyteller by night.
And as always, I'm your co-host, Scott.
This is our second multi-case episode of the year. As a reminder, there will be 4 total, with 1 airing in each quarter of 2024. We'll still be putting out our regular single-case episodes every other Monday. Nothing has changed in that regard. These multi-case episodes are something extra and will allow us to cover up to a dozen more little-known cases over the course of the year. Each of the stories in these episodes will be a little shorter than the cases we cover in our regular episodes, and that's simply because there isn't as much information out there on these cases. These are cases that are, by and large, relatively unknown outside the localities in which they occurred. So please, if you have any information on any of these cases, let investigators know. We'll include contact information for the appropriate investigating agencies at the conclusion of each story as usual. And now, on to our first story. A quick heads up, this story contains brief mention of sexual assault. We won't go into any graphic detail, but still, please listen with care. If you prefer not to hear about this subject, we recommend skipping ahead to segment 3, which tells the story of Niqi Cavanaugh-De Calderon's unsolved disappearance. Jane Pritchard was last seen alive on September 20th, 1986. She was 28 years old and a graduate student at the University of Maryland. There, she was working towards a master's degree in botany, a field that was truly her passion. Jane had always felt close to nature, having grown up on her family's farm where she developed a lifelong love of both flora and fauna. When she wasn't in class, she could often be found working at the Brookside Botanical Gardens in Montgomery County, Maryland. And when she wasn't in classes, at work or at home in the flower garden she'd planted around the cute little cottage she lived in, she could usually be found in the woods studying native plants. She'd always had a green thumb, even in childhood. She was truly immersed in the world of botany, and it was all for a good cause. She had her heart set on an impactful career as an environmental attorney. She loved the natural world that she spent so much time studying and wanted to protect it. By the fall of 1986, she was very nearly done with her graduate degree. In fact, she was almost ready to present her thesis. But first, she needed to finish up the research she'd spent the past several years conducting. That research was centered on the American hog peanut plant, a little-known perennial vine native to the eastern and midwestern U.S. The plant produces flowers both above and below ground, and the subterranean flowers develop into edible tubers. Both the flowers and the foliage provide food to a variety of wildlife. Jane was studying the way in which the plant's leaves turn toward the sun during daylight hours. This may sound like a very niche subject of study, and it was, but for Jane, every aspect of how the plant lived was exceptionally fascinating.
I'm just surprised we're talking about peanuts, and it's not the kind that we think of when we eat on a daily basis, given the name of the plant.
Oh my goodness, Jane would love that statement/question because It is not the typical peanut plant that you think of, and yet this plant provides food for a broad variety of wildlife. It is very cool, very interesting. I can tell you that Jane was so fascinated by the process in which this plant's leaves turn toward the sun, and so enthusiastic about her work in general, that according to her mom, she once basically forced her family to sit down and watch her present a slideshow presentation she'd prepared on that very subject. Her mom told the Washington Post that, quote, "The family was forced to sit and watch the slides and the progress of her bean plant as it followed the sun," end quote. While Jane's family members may not have found the minutiae of botanical studies as dazzling as she did, the undergrad pupils who she taught as a student teacher felt differently. They loved her style of teaching. In fact, according to an article by journalist Tom Vasey, of the 50 student teachers that the University of Maryland's botany department had at the time, Jane was the highest reviewed by a significant margin. She had a true passion for the subject matter, and it showed in her teaching. On the afternoon of Friday, September 19th, Jane drove about an hour and a half from her home in Maryland to the neighboring state of Delaware. For the past 3 years, she'd been conducting her research on the hog peanut in Delaware's Blackbird National Forest. For the sake of that research, she needed to observe the plant early in the morning, around dawn. Fortunately, she had a friend who lived in Delaware near the forest and was able to spend Friday night at their home. The following morning, she awoke before dawn and headed to the forest. Because she'd been making research trips there for several years, she was familiar with the area. When she arrived, she parked her Chevy Blazer along an access road that lay just south of Blackbird Forest Road, which is the main road traversing the 5,400-acre, or about 2,185-hectare, state forest. According to an article by Robin Brown for the Delaware News Journal, after exiting her vehicle, Jane set up electronic equipment that stretched from her vehicle and into the woods to a spot about 30 yards, or about 27 meters, in. She had a generator that powered her monitoring equipment, which she would carefully attach to the hog peanut plant's vines in order to accurately track their movement.
I'm not really sure what I was expecting when you said attaching electronic equipment, but I didn't anticipate it being attached to the vines to track the movement.
Oh yes, she's literally attaching little electronic sensors, movement monitors to the actual plant. This is a very delicate and involved process.
I was thinking more along the lines of like a time-lapse camera.
Oh no, it was far more involved than that. After setting up her equipment, she settled down to begin her research in earnest. It was an intensive process. Using pen and paper, she manually and diligently recorded the data her equipment produced by the minute. Because she was keeping a minute-by-minute data log, we know exactly when she was interrupted. It occurred when she was 3 hours into her study at approximately 10 a.m. That was when someone forced her to turn her attention away from the delicate mechanisms of leaf movement and toward them, and presumably that's when they killed her. However, no one would discover what happened until that afternoon. It was a couple who discovered Jane's body, a man and a woman who'd come to the Blackbird State Forest to camp. They arrived at some point midway through the afternoon and set up their tent. There was a breeze blowing, so wrangling their tent was a bit of a challenge, but they eventually managed. And after that was done, they decided to spend the rest of the afternoon walking the trails near their campsite. It was a warm September afternoon, and they were excited to explore together, to admire the trees and their foliage, and perhaps to even catch glimpses of local wildlife. The fact that they might instead stumble into some gruesome crime scene never crossed their minds. But that's exactly what happened. During their hike at about 5:30 p.m., they saw something unexpected on the forest floor protruding from the brush. That something was Jane's body, which was bloody and only partially clothed. Shocked, the couple fled the scene and rushed to report what they discovered to law enforcement. When investigators arrived on scene, they found exactly what the couple had reported seeing and knew they were investigating a homicide. Jane had been fatally shot. Her blood had soaked into the same rich soil that housed the plant she'd been studying, and it was clear that the gunshot wound had been intentionally inflicted. Now, to be clear, it was hunting season at the time, the opening weekend of squirrel season to be exact, and the Blackbird State Forest was public land open to licensed hunters. And while accidental shootings do sometimes occur in hunting scenarios, it was clear that that was not what had happened to Jane, and here's why. For starters, Jane's body was partially unclothed. Since she would not have had any reason to undress herself, this suggests that her killer was the one to remove her clothing. Obviously, this implies a sexual motive for homicide. During the course of my research, I wasn't able to find any informational sources that stated whether or not Jane had been sexually assaulted. However, we don't need that information to conclude that her killer was sexually motivated. The fact that her body was found in a state of undress is enough to reasonably draw that conclusion. Secondly, Jane had been shot with a shotgun loaded with pellet ammunition, the kind that a squirrel hunter might use. When fired, this type of ammunition projects a volley of small metal pellets rather than a single bullet. The farther they travel, the more the pellets spread out, so they're capable of covering and striking a large area. This fact is essentially the point of shotguns. A shooter can hit a target without the kind of precision shooting required by other types of firearms. However, according to an article by Robin Brown for the Delaware News Journal, during autopsy, a medical examiner found that Jane's wounds were to her neck and left shoulder. This is a pretty small area for a shotgun blast, which suggests that she may have been shot from a close range, meaning that her killer knowingly shot a human being and not an animal. Now, Scott, you're a lot more knowledgeable about the mechanisms of firearm function than I am, but I did do a little research on the physics of shotgun pellet spread so that I could talk about this with you, hopefully without sounding like a complete doofus. My main question to you right now is, a person is shot with shotgun and their neck and one shoulder are all that's hit. To you, does that suggest that they were probably shot from a pretty close range?
It depends on what kind of choke the shotgun was using and also what size shotgun it was.
Okay.
If you're talking about something that's smaller, like a 410, there are pistols that shoot that also because it's such a small and compact round. It's not going to have the same spread as a larger bore shotgun.
So what some people might call a snake gun.
Yes.
I have to admit, I hadn't thought of that at all.
So if you're using a shotgun like that, or if you're talking about a 12 gauge, which
would be a more commonly used hunting shotgun.
For many animals, the 12 gauge would be considered overkill unless you get into like deer or heavier game.
Right.
That being said, if you're close up with the 12 gauge, depending on the choke, you'll get a different pattern.
Okay. For our listeners, can you explain what the choke means?
So choke is a insert that you put into the barrel of your shotgun, and it modifies the spread of the pellets.
Okay. So that would absolutely affect this in a very direct manner.
Just a quick reference. I wanted to make sure I had some more accurate numbers than just going off of memory. So according to meateater.com, a cylinder choke will produce a 40-inch or 1 meter spread at 25 yards. An improved cylinder will produce a 40-inch spread at 30 yards. A modified choke will produce that spread at 35 yards. And a full choke will create that same 1 meter spread at 40 yards.
Okay, so we're talking about a meter or larger spread. So for our American listeners, that's 3 feet or larger. That is quite large.
Compared to what, the 6 inches between the neck and shoulder?
Yes, an incredibly tight shot pattern, wouldn't you agree?
Yes. So you're either really close with a very small bore shotgun, or you're further out with a very heavy choke.
Which would not be what you would expect from someone hunting for squirrel, because if you had that tight pattern and you were shooting a squirrel with it, well, there's not going to be anything left when you get to the animal in question after shooting it.
I'm sure someone out there will say that they have shot a squirrel with a 12 gauge. I don't understand the point of it.
I don't understand the point either. I will say that in my world, you shoot a squirrel to eat it like any other animal, but I do think there are some people out there who shoot them just for the sake of killing something. Scott, real quick, let me just ask you. Imagine that a hunter is going out into the woods to shoot squirrel, but they see a human woman and they think, this is my chance. I'm going to murder her. Do you think that that hunter, quote unquote, is concerned about whether or not they can eat the squirrel that they would shoot? Or do you think they're just out there for the fun of killing something?
Well, seeing as how human women and squirrels share absolutely zero things in common, I'm going to say that they're out there for the kill and not for the ethics or trying to hunt for food.
That's certainly what I would think, and they're probably a really bad shot, hence why they need a shotgun to kill a little squirrel.
And with that being said, they may be using one of those heavier shotguns.
I think you're right. I think that this is someone who probably went out literally just to kill. They were probably willing to settle for a squirrel, but if a human being fell within their crosshairs, I think they would have taken advantage of it. It's a very sick mindset, and I think that's what we're seeing here without getting too ahead of myself. Now, when it comes to my understanding of the shot patterning, I prefer usually to seek out academic studies whenever I'm researching anything remotely technical. However, when it comes to hunting-related matters, Scott, I sometimes find that a decidedly non-academic publication has exactly the info I'm looking for. In this case, I am referring, of course, to one of the OG hunting magazines, Field and Stream.
There's definitely something to be said for those kind of articles. These are people that are out there in the field, testing gear, trying these different methods.
Absolutely. In relevance to Jane's case, I located a Field and Stream article on shotgun spread evaluation, and the gist of what I learned is this. And Scott, you know more, so tell me if you agree. A shotgun fired at a target from a distance of 40 yards, or about 36 meters, which is generally considered the maximum effective shooting distance for a shotgun in a hunting context, typically results in a spread with a diameter of about 30 inches, or about 3/4 of a meter. There may be some pellets that strike outside of that diameter, but 30 inches is generally lauded as the maximum size of an effective shot pattern. Does that sound right?
So that goes back to the choke that I brought up earlier. Yes, you can definitely get that size spread.
Okay, excellent. I knew that Field and Stream would not let me down. So, shotgun spreads can be pretty large. A spread of 30 inches, nearly a meter, would be enough to pepper an adult's entire head and torso with pellets. But Jane's wounds were limited to her neck and left shoulder, suggesting that her killer fired upon her from a close distance, never giving the pellets a chance to spread widely. This would have resulted in a dense shot pattern, which would be, and in this case certainly was, deadly. So the fact that Jane was killed with a shotgun suggests that she was probably killed by a hunter, likely one who stumbled upon her in the woods and considered it a ripe opportunity for committing a heinous crime. They would have known that even if anyone heard the shot, they would have written it off as a hunter taking a crack at a squirrel. So during the course of their investigation, detectives learned that there had been somewhere between 25 and 50 squirrel hunters in the Blackbird State Forest on the day of Jane's murder. The question was, who were they and who among them might have been responsible for her death? In an attempt to answer this question, investigators interviewed more than 300 people, had extensive forensic analysis of recovered evidence, including the shotgun pellets conducted by experts, and even submitted some evidence to the FBI for analysis. Among the hunters who had been in the Blackbird State Forest that day, one drew their attention. His name was Michael Lloyd, and he was a 27-year-old janitor who had been in the woods hunting squirrels that day. Investigators first became aware of Lloyd when he approached them and told them that, 1, he'd seen Jane in the woods that day and had spoken to her, and 2, that he'd also seen her speaking to another male hunter. Based off of what Lloyd had to say, investigators had a sketch made of this other hunter and distributed it. They believed what Lloyd had told them primarily because he had accurately described Jane, what she'd been wearing, and what kind of vehicle she drove. Obviously, he really had seen her in the woods that day. Eventually, though, investigators' focus shifted from the allegedly existent other hunter and to Lloyd himself. Reportedly, investigators were suspicious because Lloyd's story about what had happened that day changed over time. Investigators began to wonder whether Lloyd himself may have been responsible for Jane's death and was simply inserting himself into the investigation, as killers sometimes do. Investigators obtained a search warrant for Lloyd's residence and removed a variety of property, including a lot of books. What exactly was in them, I don't know, but thanks to court records, we know that investigators allege that their contents held evidentiary value. Within just weeks of Jane's death, Lloyd was arrested on charges of first-degree murder and possession of a firearm during the commission of a felony. Although he was held without bail, he would only remain incarcerated for 10 months. The charges against Lloyd were dropped due to what was, at the time, a cutting-edge scientific discovery.
I can only imagine it's DNA of some sort.
Exactly. Investigators had found a hair on Jane's body, one that they assumed likely belonged to her killer. DNA testing was in its infancy at the time, but they pursued testing and were shocked to learn that the DNA profile obtained from the hair did not match Michael Lloyd. The charges against him were dropped, and since then, no other suspect has ever been publicly identified. The person who callously murdered Jane as she peacefully studied plants that most visitors to the Blackbird State Forest overlooked or trampled underfoot remains nameless today, nearly 40 years later. Meanwhile, Jane's friends and family remember her for her boundless enthusiasm for the natural world, her intelligence, and the way she loved to let her hair down, literally, and let the wind blow through it as she drove her convertible on sunny days. If you know anything about the death of Jane Pritchard, please contact the Newcastle County Police's Cold Case Homicide Squad at 302-395-2781. Or if you wish to remain anonymous, you can call Delaware Crime Stoppers at 800-847-3333, or submit a tip via their website, which is delaware.crimestoppersweb.com. And now, on to our next story. A quick heads up, this story contains brief mention of sexual assault. We won't go into any graphic detail, but still, please listen with care. If you prefer not to hear about this subject, we recommend skipping ahead to segment 3, which tells the story of Niqi Cavanaugh-De Calderon's unsolved disappearance. Mary and Susanna Stodden were last seen alive on July 11, 2006. They were 56 and 27 years old, respectively, and were mother and daughter. They lived in Seattle, and in many ways, Susanna was remarkably like her mom. Both women were known for their kind and conscientious personalities, and they both really enjoyed working with kids. In fact, they were each employed in education, Mary as a longtime elementary school librarian and Susanna as a brand new teaching intern. But it was another shared passion that brought Mary and Susanna to the place where they spent their final hours. That passion was their deep love for the outdoors and their appreciation of the natural world. This passion was something that manifested in a variety of ways and characterized their lives. For example, Susanna was always finding ways to do something for the wilderness she loved so much. If there was a tree planting or stream restoring project, she'd be there. If there was a sustainability class or initiative, she'd sign up. And one of her signature housekeeping moves was assembling these little non-toxic, all-natural bathroom cleaning kits that she made herself.
Interesting. I like it.
She definitely appreciated the little things and lived a modest life. This included bicycling to work and keeping an avid eye on the wildlife in her area down to the smallest birds. And if there was a trail, she'd hike it, sometimes backpacking in the wilderness for weeks at a time. Like so many of her other characteristics, the joy Susanna found in hiking was something she'd gotten from her mom. Mary and Susanna were both avid hikers, and the Pacific Northwest is, of course, a hiking paradise. Every week they hiked together in the Cascade Mountains. The week of their death was no exception. July 11th was a Tuesday, and since it was summer and Mary and Susanna both worked in education, they had the day off. They set out that morning to make the most of the day, which for them would mean hiking Pinnacle Lake. The Washington Trails Association describes the hike at Pinnacle Lake as a, quote, short but rough, end quote, trek to two small lakes on the side of Mount Pilchuck. The hike is relatively short at just under 4 miles, or about 6.5 kilometers in round-trip length, but the difficult, rocky, and often precariously muddy terrain puts it solidly into the territory of moderate difficulty. Hikers who tough it out, though, will eventually reach a lake that's rarely, if ever, crowded, according to the Washington Trails Association. For Mary and Susanna, it would be a pretty easy day hike. It was one they'd made before, and each of them had completed much longer treks in the past, many times over. They reached the trailhead at 10 a.m. and expected to complete the loop and return home by mid-afternoon. However, when David, that's Mary's husband and Susanna's dad, arrived home from a day of work at 5:30 p.m., he was surprised to find the house empty. At first, he thought that maybe Mary and Susanna had stopped somewhere on the way home, maybe for groceries. David had plans of his own that evening. He'd be going to a park to ride his bike, and it wouldn't be just a casual ride. He was actually training for an intense 200-mile, or about 322-kilometer ride that he had coming up. He would be training with a friend who would be meeting him at the park at an agreed-upon time. So David went to the park, met up with his friend, and biked with them for several hours. While there, he stopped periodically to call Mary and Susanna's cell phones. As they repeatedly failed to answer, he grew more and more worried. By the time he made it home from his ride, it was 9:15 at night. The house was still empty, and he knew something had to be wrong. So he started making phone calls, not to Mary and Susanna's phones anymore, but to local law enforcement agencies. If something had happened to Mary and Susanna, if they'd been in an accident on the way home from their hike, for example, surely some local agency would know. But time after time, he was disappointed. No one seemed to know anything about what might have happened to Mary and Susanna, and by this point, David was sure that something had happened. At about 10 p.m., David put down his phone and turned for the door. Since authorities didn't know anything, he'd just have to go out and look for Mary and Susanna himself. But before he made it to the door, there was a knock. When he answered the door, he found 2 detectives standing on his doorstep. As soon as he saw them, he knew that his worries had been justified. Detectives don't just make unexpected house calls without grim reason. Detectives told David the last thing he wanted to hear, which was that both Mary and Susanna were deceased. Both of them, his wife and his daughter, had been dead for hours at that point. Their bodies had been found on the Pinnacle Lake hiking trail. It wasn't immediately clear how they died, but investigators thought there was a chance that they'd been attacked by a large wild animal.
So, large wild animal.
Uh-huh.
One of the things that I find odd about it is generally I wouldn't expect an animal to attack 2 humans at that level.
You are not alone in finding this odd. I sort of raised my eyebrows when I read it, and the best I can tell you is that this was at least what detectives told David at the time. Whether they really believed an animal might have been responsible is officially unknown. In reality, though, both women had been fatally shot, and I have a sneaking suspicion that the detectives knew that. Now, it wasn't authorities who'd originally found Mary and Susanna's bodies, but rather other hikers. Among those hikers was a married couple who stumbled upon Mary and Susanna's remains on their way back to the trailhead. Naturally, they were shocked and terrified when they saw both women slumped on the trail, bloody and partially undressed. One of the hikers has since recounted how, at the time, he and his wife had only had one potential weapon, a small axe, with them at the time of the hike. It took them 30 minutes to make it back to the trailhead, and the whole time he maintained a white-knuckled grip on the axe, because neither he nor his wife believed that an animal had killed the women. It seemed obvious to them that they'd been murdered, and for all they knew, the murderer might be around the next bend in the trail. To make matters even more shocking, the couple had encountered Mary and Susanna earlier in their hike, still alive and well. They'd stopped briefly to make small talk and had found them to be, quote, exceptionally nice, end quote, according to an LA Times article. It was difficult to imagine what kind of person could possibly have wanted to murder the friendly mother and daughter hikers. Upon reaching the trailhead, the couple hurried to report what they'd found to police. They could still hardly believe what they'd seen. As it would turn out, though, they weren't the only ones to report the crime, nor were they the first. Another couple of hikers had already notified authorities. Speaking of authorities, they were initially tight-lipped about the details of the murder scene. They've publicly acknowledged that Mary and Susanna were shot, but that was pretty much it at the time. Since then, it has been publicly disclosed that both women were shot in the head at a close range. The murder weapon was a small-caliber handgun. Investigators almost immediately focused on one specific person of interest. Scott, any guesses as to who that person of interest was?
Was it her husband?
Yes, that's right. As we've often said before, when women are killed, they're usually killed by someone they know, often a romantic partner and/or family member. So, naturally, investigators needed to consider the possibility that David might have taken the lives of his own wife and daughter. Now, David cooperated with the investigation, voluntarily participating in interviews and polygraph tests. He knew it was standard procedure for investigators to consider a murder victim's spouse, but he figured that investigators would rule him out pretty quickly and to move on.
Wonder if that's why they went with the animal attack and led in with that to conceal what they actually knew.
I wonder the exact same thing. Investigators did not, in fact, quickly rule out David and move on, and when they didn't, he grew frustrated. Investigators seemed in no hurry to discount him as a potential suspect despite the fact that he had an alibi. Meanwhile, the person or persons who'd murdered his wife and daughter for no apparent reason were still out there, and for all anyone knew, they might strike again. There was no rational reason for anyone to want to kill Mary and Susanna. If they hadn't been safe on the trail, then who was? Nevertheless, it would reportedly take 12 years before investigators would lessen their focus on David. At that point, in 2018, investigators reportedly told David that they wouldn't continue with their investigation unless he could pass a polygraph test. He had taken 2 in the past, with the results of the first reportedly being inconclusive and the results of the second never actually being shared with him. So, David agreed, again, even though it was frankly insulting at that point, to take a 3rd test, which he passed. Scott, it probably doesn't surprise you that the results of his tests varied, since polygraphs are, as we often say, pseudoscientific hot garbage.
I've said it before, I'll say it again. I 100% believe that they are more a scare tactic that ham-fisted investigators use than any actual investigative powers.
I absolutely agree. Unfortunately, the investigation had reportedly been stunted for 12 years due to investigators' apparent fixation upon that particular hot garbage hurdle. And by that time, David was left to wonder, what crucial clues and investigative opportunities might investigators have missed while leaning so heavily into him as a potential suspect for more than a decade?
It's a fair question and one that deserves to be answered, but...
Meanwhile, David hadn't been the only person devastated by the loss. He had 2 other daughters, also in their 20s at the time, who'd also been heartbroken. And then there were all the other people who had known Mary and Susanna, their friends, neighbors, co-workers, and students. Everyone had mourned, including the kids at the elementary school where Mary had worked as a librarian for years. According to an LA Times article by Tomas Alex Tizon, students at the school had made a cardboard sign that read, "Mary in the library, the nicest person in the universe." They'd hung the sign by the school's front doors and had cried while they'd done it. If grief were a measurable force capable of compelling answers to come forth once it reached some sort of critical mass or tipping point, we would know who killed Mary and Susanna. But it's not, and the grief over their deaths remains today unassuaged by the lack of answers. No suspect has ever been named in relation to the double homicide of Mary and Susanna Stodden. Meanwhile, David has spent the past 18 years trying to find answers that investigators haven't produced. He frequently makes the journey to the trail where Mary and Susanna were murdered and hangs up posters asking the public for tips. Sometimes people use the posters for target practice, shooting out the picture of Mary and Susanna in the center, and then he'll return to find cartridge casings and cigarette butts scattered over the leaf litter below. On these occasions, he simply replaces the posters with fresh copies and keeps hoping that someone will finally come forward with information.
Not everyone is the human equivalent of a polygraph test, but those people are.
Oh yeah, there's some hot garbage people up there in the woods shooting up these signs. On that note, in an often lonely effort to keep Mary and Susanna's case in the public eye, David has participated in numerous media interviews over the years, basically anytime he's asked. In one of those many interviews, a news piece from 2018, he expressed his frustrations with the Snohomish County Sheriff's Office. And those frustrations didn't all revolve around the polygraph tests or the perhaps myopic focus on him as a potential suspect either. He's also expressed his frustration over reportedly being told that the department was short-staffed and equipped with only limited resources. And you know what, Scott? As someone who works for a law enforcement agency, I understand his frustration over reportedly being told these things. He has every right to feel this way, because being understaffed is a reality that many, if not most, American law enforcement agencies are currently living with. And the way we handle it is by prioritizing what's most important. Naturally, what's most important is violent crime. When it comes to choosing where and when to use limited staffing and resources, violent crime will always take a front seat. And what could be more pressing and worthy of resource allocation than a seemingly random double murder of 2 innocent victims in a public recreation area? Not only was the crime heinous, it was also committed by someone who, as far as we know, may still pose a threat to public safety. It's difficult to imagine a crime more worthy of attention and resources. Additionally, there are investigative resources available to departments with limited resources. In cases like this, local level authorities can reach out to state or federal agencies for investigative assistance.
Yeah, considering its location, I'm actually a little surprised that it is the local municipality that's handling the investigation.
You and me both. I was surprised they didn't reach out to a larger agency for help. In a recent interview with journalist Eric Wilkinson, David said, quote, "I still think about Mary and Susanna every couple of hours. I remember when they were first killed. It was every second," end quote. Although the exact circumstances of Mary and Susanna's murders aren't known, the fact that they were found with their clothing partially removed suggests that the killer's motive was sexual. David has speculated that the killer might have begun the attack with the intent to sexually assault them and that they might have fought back. As for who that killer is, we of course don't know, but we can make a few statistically based assumptions. For starters, they were almost certainly male, as nearly all sexually motivated murders are committed by male offenders. Secondly, there's a strong chance that they frequented the area where the murders occurred and likely lived somewhere nearby, or at least did at the time. I say this because, statistically speaking, most killers kill where they're comfortable, and most people are comfortable close to home. Therefore, the chances of Mary and Susanna's killer being some kind of tourist or one-time visitor to the area are relatively slim. And remember, the trail that Mary and Susanna were killed on was steep, rocky, muddy, and considered to be of moderate difficulty. Therefore, their killer was likely someone who, at least at the time, was in decent or better physical shape. Lastly, in defiance of statistical norms, Mary and Susanna probably did not know their killer or killers. Most likely, their deaths were rare stranger killings. Now, of course, these factors we've just mentioned don't narrow down the suspect pool much. There are many, many men living in the Seattle area who match this broad description, which is why it's so crucial that if you have a tip, no matter how small or inconsequential it may seem, you report it. In January of 2024, David told K5 News the following, quote, "Since the detectives have told me they are not really going to work on it unless someone comes in and confesses, if it's going to be solved, I'm the one who's really going to have to push for it," end quote. David has already spent the last 18 years pushing for justice for Mary and Susanna. He's still out there hiking the same mountains they died in and hanging posters that offer a $1,000 reward for information. And Scott, to be honest, that's the detail that really gets me. As far as reward amounts for double murders or murders at all go, I think $1,000 is probably the lowest one I've ever heard of.
Yeah, I'm shocked and kind of heartbroken.
It is incredibly shocking, considering the seemingly random and brutal nature of this crime in which a kind-hearted mother and daughter were gunned down execution style on a public nature trail, possibly during the course of a sexual assault. This is the type of crime that I would expect to result in an investigation backed by a serious amount of award money and public interest. It really breaks my heart to think of David having to hike around all on his own and hang up those posters offering that small award amount year after year. The burden of seeking justice should not be his to bear alone.
I think that it's very likely if not almost a guarantee, that he probably had to raise that money himself also.
Yes.
I can't see a department that has failed him on such a basic level and
Right.
continues to fail him and has guaranteed failure on their part. How can you succeed, or how can you do anything with the case when you've given up on it completely? It's enraging, and it's exactly what's wrong with so many departments in America.
To be honest, it makes me angry. It really breaks my heart. Like I said, the burden of seeking justice, it absolutely should not be his to bear alone, and yet it has been. With that being said, if you know anything about the deaths of Mary and Susanna Stodden, please contact the Snohomish County Sheriff's Office at 425-388-3393. And now, on to our next story. Niqi Cavanaugh-De Calderon, who went by Niqi, was last seen alive on February 26, 2022. She was 42 years old at the time and lived in Portland, Oregon. This was a place that suited Niqi perfectly because her life was characterized by a passion for two things in particular: art and the natural world. Opportunities to enjoy both of these things are, of course, abundant in northwestern Oregon. Niqi had devoted her professional life to one of the most rigorous forms of art there is: ballet. She was a professional ballerina and was part of Portland's vibrant dance scene. For years, she danced for a company known for its regional and international performances. She was very good at what she did, but shortly before her disappearance, her life took a major turn when she received an unexpected medical diagnosis. Niqi was diagnosed with a brain aneurysm. A brain aneurysm is a bulge that occurs in a weakened section of a blood vessel, in the brain, of course, and if an aneurysm ruptures, it can be very deadly. So to say that this was a life-altering diagnosis would be an understatement. Now, I don't know what kind of prognosis or treatment plan Niqi had been given by doctors. However, I can tell you that according to sources like the Clackamas County Sheriff's Office, Niqi may have been experiencing cognitive impairment as a result of her condition. On the day of her disappearance, February 26th, Niqi was visiting her mom in Rhododendron, Oregon, which is a small village community located near the foot of Mount Hood. It's a picturesque place about an hour's drive from Portland. For a nature lover like Niqi, it was probably a delightful place to visit. One of Niqi's favorite outdoor pastimes was foraging for mushrooms, and that may be what she had intended to do that day when she left her mom's house on foot to enjoy a brief walk. However, she never returned from that walk, and she has not been seen since. Scott, I'll be honest, the publicly available information regarding Niqi's disappearance is pretty bare bones. I've already told you the majority of what I know about her case.
That's surprising.
Right? I wish there was more reporting out there on her disappearance, but for whatever reason, news articles are short, as well as few and far in between. Now, this sparse reporting, combined with the recency of her disappearance, made me want to include her case in this episode, even if I'm not able to answer all the questions you and listeners may have about her disappearance. So please know I'm not withholding any known details or being overly brief on purpose. Niqi's case simply hasn't received much media attention so far.
We can only hope that changes.
Right, it strikes me as a little odd considering that she's not just a missing person. Because of the serious nature of her medical condition, she's a missing and endangered person. Her case definitely deserves more exposure than it's received so far. Now back to what we do know. Naturally, when Niqi didn't return from her walk, her family reported her missing to the Clackamas County Sheriff's Office. While deputies were not able to locate Niqi, they soon found some of her belongings and not in a place that they had expected. According to an article published by Oregon Arts Watch, Niqi's backpack, which contained personal items including her ID, was located 40 miles, or about 64 kilometers away from where she disappeared. She may have been carrying the backpack when she went for her walk, although I wasn't able to verify that for sure. In any case, the backpack was found at the Clackamas Town Center shopping mall, apparently abandoned. How and when it wound up there is unknown. Whether it made its way there with Niqi or with someone else, that too was a mystery.
That seems not only like an incredibly far distance for that backpack to travel, but
Yes,
a very strange location to deposit it.
very. Now, as an analyst, when I learned this, I immediately wondered whether there were any security cameras in the area where the backpack was found, and if so, what they may have captured. Unfortunately, though, I was not able to track down any such information. Presumably, though, it is something that investigators have looked into. So, what happened to Niqi? There are numerous possibilities, each complicated by her medical condition. It's possible, of course, that she experienced a medical emergency during her walk into the woods, possibly after becoming disoriented or confused, which could have caused her to stray from her planned path of travel. Now, obviously, neither she nor her remains have been found during searches of those woods, but locating people or remains in a robust woodland environment like the one she walked into can be difficult, even for seasoned searchers. It is, unfortunately, possible that she could have died of a medical event and simply hasn't been found. Of course, it's also possible that something less straightforward occurred. The fact that her personal belongings were found 40 miles or about 64 kilometers away, abandoned, certainly raises questions. We know Niqi left for her walk on foot, but could she have at some point left the area in a vehicle with someone for some reason? The fact that she may have been experiencing cognitive impairment at the time of her disappearance means that it's difficult, if not impossible, to rule out any possibility. That includes, of course, the possibility of foul play. Now, it's more likely that Niqi experienced some sort of medical event or accident than foul play, for sure. However, Scott, I'd be remiss not to point out that the rest of the stories included in this episode all involve women who set out for everyday hikes and were, against all odds, murdered by strangers for no apparent reason.
I know it's something that you concern yourself with, but it's a realistic possibility, and I can't see anybody rolling it out, especially when the bag ends up 40 miles away. It does not grow feet and walk there itself.
Sure, now, to be fair, these sort of random violent crimes are very rare. Millions of Americans, including women, safely enjoy the outdoors every single day. But every once in a blue moon, crimes like these do occur. If they didn't, we wouldn't be making this episode. Whether or not Niqi might have experienced violence at the hands of someone she encountered during her walk is unknown. While we're on the subject, though, it's worth mentioning that Niqi is a transgender woman. Scott, as we've occasionally discussed in other episodes, transgender people, especially transgender women, unfortunately experience much higher rates of violence than the average woman or person, statistically speaking. To be specific, according to a recent study published in the American Journal of Public Health, transgender women experience violence at a rate 4 times higher than non-transgender American women or people. That's a huge disparity. So whenever a transgender woman goes missing, the possibility, however slim it may otherwise seem, of foul play is always something worth considering. Lastly, as with most disappearances, there's another possibility to be considered, and that's the possibility of self-harm. At the time of her disappearance, Niqi had recently received a life-altering medical diagnosis. She was only 42 years old and had always been intensely fit and active. Ballerinas really have no choice, as their art is very physically demanding. Most likely, she had not seen her diagnosis coming. Scott, in an attempt to gain some understanding of what Niqi's diagnosis might have meant for her future, I did a little research on the basics of treatment options for unruptured brain aneurysms. I learned that there are basically 3 possible courses of action. One is conservative management, which is basically watching and waiting and is often prescribed to older patients, especially if their unruptured aneurysm is small and they have no family history of subarachnoid hemorrhage. The primary downside to this option is, of course, that there's always some degree of risk that the aneurysm will rupture, an event that can quickly prove fatal. Another more proactive treatment option is a type of surgery known as microsurgical clipping. Basically, this procedure involves opening up the skull, locating the unruptured aneurysm, and clipping it in order to isolate it from the parent blood vessel. It's an intensely invasive form of brain surgery. A third option, endovascular management, is also surgical, but involves a less invasive procedure conducted via a catheter that's maneuvered within the blood vessels. Although it's not an open surgery like a craniotomy, it's still a serious procedure. It involves the placement of stents and other medical devices in order to stop blood flow to the aneurysm. I say all this, Scott, to convey this. Niqi was facing a major medical diagnosis, and something as serious as brain surgery may even have been in her future. Certainly, this would have had some kind of impact on her mental health. On the other hand, the same condition could have made her more vulnerable to accidents or medical emergencies, and even possibly to foul play. Like I said, she's not just a missing person. Because of her medical condition, she's a missing and endangered person. When it comes to where her case stands now, the only thing that's publicly known for sure is that Niqi hasn't been seen or heard from for more than 2 years at the time of this recording. She's badly missed by her friends and family members, and investigators are asking for the public's help in the form of any tips, no matter how small they may seem, regarding her disappearance or whereabouts. If you know anything about the disappearance or whereabouts of Niqi Cavanaugh-De Calderon, please contact the Clackamas County Sheriff's Office at 503-785-5000. And now, on to our next story. Dr. Honoree Fleming was last seen alive on October 5th, 2023. She was 77 years old at the time and lived in Castleton, Vermont. Castleton is a small town of less than 5,000 people. By and large, it's a safe and peaceful place to call home. Despite its small size, it contains a college campus, the students of which account for approximately half of the town's population. Scott, if you're picturing a tiny community situated amongst rolling, forested New England wilderness, you've got it exactly right. The Castleton area is a beautiful place, as Dr. Fleming well knew. She'd lived in the community for years and had served as the dean of Vermont State University Castleton, which is the aforementioned college campus. A highly intelligent woman, prior to becoming a college dean, Dr. Fleming had worked as a college professor of chemistry and biochemistry. She was fiercely academic with a scientific mind, and her research had contributed to science's understanding of cancer.
That's impressive.
Very impressive. Make no mistake, though, Dr. Fleming's intelligence was not accompanied by ego, which, to be frank, is pretty rare for people in academic leadership positions.
From my perspective, the perceived intelligence and the ego go hand in hand.
Often that's the case. But Scott, Dr. Fleming's childhood had been equal parts modest and difficult. According to an article by Tiffany Tan for the VT Digger, she'd grown up in New York City, one of several children of a mother who'd immigrated there from Ireland, fleeing from poverty there and seeking new opportunities. Her dad, unfortunately, had struggled with alcoholism and had died as a result while Dr. Fleming had still been young. With the odds stacked so high against her, her mother had never been able to escape poverty. These struggles likely contributed to Dr. Fleming's empathetic and humble nature. One of her colleagues remembers her having a soft spot for underprivileged students who came from difficult backgrounds. She would always go out of her way to support them. And in addition to being intelligent and academically minded, she was known for being down-to-earth and very kind. In an interview with the Middlebury campus, a colleague of Dr. Fleming's described her as a gentle person who never bragged about her own achievements. In her colleague's words, quote, "She met you as a person first, a radiant presence, solid and genuine," end quote. And her family members remember her similarly. At the time of her death, she'd been married to her husband, a Pulitzer Prize-winning writer named Ron Powers, for decades. Like his wife, Ron was incredibly intelligent and accomplished, as the Pulitzer Prize suggests. Scott, if you're at all familiar with the movie Flags of Our Fathers, which was directed by Steven Spielberg, you know Ron's work.
Oh, do I?
Yes, he wrote the book that the movie was based on.
Okay.
Yeah, that's him. So together, Dr. Fleming and Ron had raised a family, 2 sons to be specific. Tragically, by the time of Dr. Fleming's murder, one of their sons was already long deceased, having died in 2005 as a result of a struggle with a chronic, incurable disease. Perhaps the family hoped that the tragedy would have been their last, and certainly if they were to experience another, they would not have imagined the form it took. October 5th was a perfect day for a hike in New England. The fall foliage was at its peak, And although she was in her later 70s, Dr. Fleming was an active person who enjoyed the outdoors. So when she decided to go for a hike that afternoon, it was nothing unusual. In fact, the trail she chose, which was just a mile or about 1.6 kilometers south of the college campus where she'd once been dean, was her known favorite. She knew from experience that the hike was going to be gorgeous, and she couldn't wait to be surrounded by the famously rich colors of autumn in Vermont. It was like something out of a calendar. The trail is known as the Delaware and Hudson Rail Trail, and as its name suggests, the trail itself lies where railroad tracks once did. It's nearly 20 miles, or about 32 kilometers in length, and if you follow the whole thing, it'll take you not only through forested areas, but scenic farmland as well. It's open to hikers, bicyclists, and horseback riders, and there are plenty of places to stop for a picnic, if one so desires. And that's not even it. According to the Vermont Department of Forest, Parks, and Recreation, during the winter months, it's also open to use by snowmobilers and skiers.
That doesn't surprise me.
So really, they've just got the whole range of recreational opportunities that can be enjoyed on this trail, hence its popularity. And as you can imagine, Scott, this scenic and easily accessible trail was pretty popular at all times of year, especially fall. During the first week of October, that's when fall foliage typically peaks in the state of Vermont, so this was a very robust time.
And being so close to a college campus.
Oh, yes.
I can't imagine it not being at least somewhat busy.
Absolutely. Busy, very popular, for good reason. To the best of my knowledge, Dr. Fleming was only planning to hike a short section of the trail that day, not the whole thing, which would have taken longer than just an afternoon on foot. She stepped onto the trail at approximately 4 p.m. and was found deceased of a single gunshot wound to the head just 30 minutes later. Like I mentioned, Scott, there would have been lots of people out enjoying the path at this time, so it's not surprising that she was found so quickly after her death. What is surprising, though, is this. Not only was someone willing to shoot and kill her, they were willing to do so on a busy trail, risking being identified and potentially quickly caught. I'm sure you're thinking the same thing I was when I read about what happened to Dr. Fleming. Why would someone do that? Why would anyone want to hurt her in the first place, and why would they be willing to put themselves at such significant personal risk to do so?
She's not any real ideal target that I can think of.
She's a 77-year-old woman out to enjoy the afternoon on her own. I mean, how cowardly do you get? Now, while I can't answer most of the big questions surrounding this case for sure, I can tell you this. Because the trail was busy, Dr. Fleming's killer was seen by witnesses, and we'll get to the killer's description shortly. Meanwhile, when investigators responded to the trail, having been told by hikers that a woman was lying dead along it, they were stunned by what they found. Dr. Fleming, a 77-year-old woman, had apparently been gunned down in cold blood. There was no apparent motive, that is to say, there were no signs of her having been robbed and no suggestion of sexual assault or a sexual motive. Nor would investigators, throughout the course of their investigation into her murder, locate anyone with any sort of personal grudge against her. In short, it appeared that her murder was random. Why Dr. Fleming was shot and killed near the beginning of her afternoon hike on the Delaware and Hudson Rail Trail is unknown. However, numerous other hikers on the trail contacted police to report that they'd seen a man on the trail acting pretty strangely in the area where Dr. Fleming was killed. Immediately, Vermont police had a professional sketch artist travel in from a neighboring state to speak to witnesses. Witnesses consistently described the potential suspect as a male in his 20s with short red hair. He'd been wearing a gray t-shirt and carrying a black backpack. We've posted the police sketch artist's portrait of the suspect on our website. The link is in the show notes. Please check it out. Scott, we've talked a lot about what kind of person Dr. Fleming was, and it's clear that she was very loved, and for good reason.
Absolutely. I mean, what's not to like so far?
She sounds like a really lovely person. Now, often when people talk about people like Dr. Fleming, they describe them as having hearts of gold. And while I certainly think that that would be an appropriate way to describe Dr. Fleming based off of what I know, her husband, Ron, a professional writer, described her even more elegantly and succinctly. He wrote on Facebook that, quote, "I have never known a more sterling heart and soul than hers," end quote. And I think that sterling is the perfect way to describe Dr. Fleming. The word on its own is synonymous with top quality. And if we consider sterling silver, well, silver as a metal is valuable and beautiful, but on its own, it's not strong enough to withstand regular wear or use. Sterling silver, on the other hand, is silver that's been strengthened and enhanced with an infusion of a stronger metal, usually copper. The result is a metal that's both precious and strong and able to endure over time, which seems fitting because Dr. Fleming was an undeniably strong woman, someone who endured significant hardship in life and loss, and she never let any of it dull her shine. The fact that she was dealt such a cruel and unfair end to her life is incredibly unfortunate, but it doesn't negate any of the tremendous good she did during her lifetime. At the time of this recording, less than a year has passed since her death, and investigators are actively seeking answers. The person who took her life does pose a potential risk to others. Obviously, a person who would randomly gun down a stranger on a busy hiking trail is not a safe or stable individual. So please, if you have any information on the murder of Dr. Honoree Fleming, please contact the Vermont State Police at 802-773-9101. Or if you prefer to remain anonymous, you can use the Vermont State Police's online tip form, which can be found at vsp.vermont.gov/tip submit.
That's all for this special multi-case episode of Last Seen Alive. Thanks for listening. Make sure you check out our website, lastseenalivepodcast.com, for photos from these stories and links to the sources we use to write them. While you're at it, follow us on Insta and Twitter at LSA Podcast. New episodes of Last Seen Alive go live every other Monday. See you then. If you think bringing unsolved cases like these to the public's attention is important, please take a moment to rate or review Last Seen Alive and tell your friends to check us out too. We'd really appreciate it. Also, don't forget to check out our new merch store where you can get an LSA t-shirt or hoodie. We donate 50% of the proceeds from every sale to the DNA Doe Project. Last Seen Alive is written and researched by you, Leah. Audio engineering and editing is provided by me, Scott.